Two questions, one big, one little. The big one is, how does all this vision of the future of New England comport with population growth, and how an additional, 3 times as much farmland fits into a population growth? And then the small question, current, is how do farmers markets, local farmers markets, and their growth over time, what does that indicate about the market's capacity to pay for the additional cost of locally grown stuff?
Okay, so 2 answers to that question. One is, we projected something that's similar to the US Census Bureau projections of a kind of slow linear growth of New England population over the next half century. So we ran it out from 15 million to 17 million. Lots of other things could happen. If the population of New England goes way up because it becomes a better part of the world to live in than the Southwest because of climate change or something like that, there could be more people than that in this part of the world, and it would be that much harder to feed a certain percent of our population. So we just had to assume something, and that's what we went with. Second question was about farmers markets, probably CSAs, things like that. What do those indicate? Those are great things. They indicate there's a lot of interest in this, and that there's people who do have the income who are willing to pay for this, and this has helped get this local food movement off the ground. So it's a terrific thing. I think the CSAs are kind of saturated in some parts of our region at the moment. There's not that many new people who want to come in. So the issue before us and farmers who want to make these direct retail connections is, okay, how do we continue to grow that? How do we make that more accessible to more people with, the ability to use SNAP benefits and to augment them with money from the health industry, to prescriptions for vegetables. I mean, people are working on policy to try to expand those kinds of outlets.
My question is very small. Brian, or Professor Donahue, on your slide, you mentioned that one of the benefits of forests is they help the water supply.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how they did that.
Well, the shorthand also for water quality. And there's nothing like having forests on the landscape to keep the water reasonably clean. So that's why Quabbin Reservoir and the big reservoirs in New York City are surrounded by lots of protected forests. And so one of the dangers of saying, oh, we're going to throw, double the cow herd and do all this beef production and clear all this land is, it's going to have an impact on water quality. And so there's ways to try to do it cleaner, but you don't want to trade a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico for a dead zone in the Gulf of Maine. Let's put it that way. So it's just an issue in front of us. The forest does it just about automatically. Farming does not. You got to do a really good job in the way you farm to keep the nutrients on the farm where you want them and keep them out of the water.
What's CSA?
Oh. CSA is community-supported agriculture, and it's a system by which people generally pay up front for a weekly share of produce through the season. Let's ask these other guys.
Okay, why don't you go there?
I think this is for Sarah Phillips. But you mentioned that food policy bill ended in 2014, and
no, I said that the press widely misinterpreted the 2014 bill as having ended a lot of these payments. And your instructor is actually the expert.
No, go ahead.
But as I was reading, and I want you to join me, do you have a microphone?
I can do it.
Okay. That it was reported, now it's like the New York Times, that it got rid of these countercyclical and deficiency payments and turned it all into crop insurance, and that specialty producers were now able to enjoy the crop insurance policies, and that we were just moving to insurance. And that's largely incorrect. There were insurance programs that were expanded, but farmers still have a choice of certain kinds of support based on their rolling 5-year averages to get price insurance. So what farmers want is not necessarily just insurance against crop loss, but insurance against low prices. And that has not ended with the 2014 bill. But I would like if you corrected or added.
Quick, cheap plug time. I have a book on the 2014
Yeah,
farm bill
that's
coming out in February. I'll let you know about that. The issue about how do we support, you know, Professor Phillips, of course, you know, she's been diving into this in a really deep way. The question is how farmers can maintain an income. The traditional debate has been, how do we ensure that farmers can make a living? Because when you have surpluses, it drives down commodity prices so much that a lot of farmers lose their farms, or at least did, or lose their livelihoods. So the farm policy...
And it's not easy just to be a wheat farmer and start something else.
That's right.
I mean, there are bioregional advantages to certain kinds of crops. You can't just start growing asparagus, right?
That's right.
In Eastern Colorado.
Eastern Colorado. And again, don't forget, the image of the 1930s was of the Dust Bowl and people leaving the farm. So, I mean, that was real. So the historical dilemma has been, you know, left, and this is the problem of economics. Each individual farmer is a rational actor, produces as much as possible on his or her land, and you know, no matter what the price is, because that's the only way you make any money. But if everybody grows as much as possible on their respective farms, the aggregate is a surplus. And if you have a glut, because you all aren't eating enough food, or there's not enough of you to eat all that food, then prices go through the floor, and only the largest, most well-capitalized farmers can survive. So government policy, going back to the 30s, at least originally, was to control production. We'll pay you not to grow stuff, or we'll take what you produced and we'll store it until global or commodity prices got high enough that we could then release it to the marketplace. And that was until the 1960s. Since then,
but there was never only southern crops.
That's right.
So everyone else could grow as much as they
That's
wanted to on their allotted acres. So we've never actually had a functioning system of production control since the 30s. That was what the fight
was
about.
We go in deep weeds on that. That's right.
No, but it's important because...
Oh, that's right. And the dilemma since then, and this is the part about insurance versus... What we've been doing really since the 1970s is when the price of a crop or commodity goes below a target, we'll pay the farm the difference. That was sort of the idea. And then over time, this idea of insurance comes because people didn't like the direct payment thing. They thought, why should we pay people this difference between the market price and this other price, you know, that direct subsidies. People got a bad taste in their mouths about direct subsidies because sometimes those subsidies went to very affluent farms or people who owned land, especially the landowners who lived in Manhattan, New York, not Manhattan, Kansas. So we said, all right, this is a fight among ag folks. All right, let's do insurance instead. We'll, you know, and by insurance we don't mean that you just buy insurance against crop losses or against losses. What we're really doing is subsidizing the cost of insurance. So no matter how you, so the simple version of this is no matter how you slice this, we're trying to subsidize, or we subsidize farm incomes. And the real battle is how you do it, without also then still getting up with the inevitable surpluses. Because all the surpluses wash around and got to go somewhere. And we hope we trade them out to, we say, well, we'll trade to China. Well, yeah. China. Yeah, China is our big importer of food.
Yeah. We run them through livestock, or we turn them into ethanol.
Ethanol?
We try to expand the consumer stuff.
Right, exactly. The bottom line here is that because of these technological innovations that Sarah talked about with the fertilizer and the hybrid seeds and all that, we produced an enormous surplus of grain, and our subsidy system has evolved to keep it that way and to keep the price nice and low mostly for processors who can then make use of this to run it through feedlots or make ethanol.
Which is why you get $1 burger.
Yeah. So if we're going to have 9 billion...
Hold on a second. We have to... All right, everyone got that so far? We'll do your next again.
It's probably a current topic, but I was just wondering, changes in weather and changes in climate over the years, what kind of impact has it had an impact, and what do you see going forward?
The studies that have been done on that have been mixed. On a global scale, the consensus expectation is that climate change will raise the cost of food, on balance. It may open up some more agricultural lands in some areas because it's getting warmer, but will make it more difficult in many of the areas that are now producing a lot of stuff. And there are USDA studies, there are lots of studies on this. Who knows, actually, because it's going to intersect with all kinds of technological changes and who knows what. But the combination of more people in the world and people with rising incomes and climate change may mean that finally the price of food begins to rise again for those kinds of reasons. If that occurs, that will begin to make it more competitively possible for farmers in regions like New England to produce more food. That would be one impact of it. Within New England itself, climate change looks kind of good for this stuff. We've got a longer growing season for our grass, for our vegetables, and so forth, some of the things I talked about. I'm not a fan of climate change, but it may mean that more production here does make sense and that more of the things that we can grow well here, we've got a better chance to. There'll be huge downsides, bigger swings, more droughts, more floods on some of our best agricultural land, pests overwintering better. So it's a little hard to parse it out. But it probably ought to mean that it's more difficult to grow food for people in the world. But it's dangerous predicting these things.
I have a question. I want first a clarification. You said that 70% of the household income in the U.S., 7% is for food.
7%, about
7%.
6.5% of household income for food eaten at home.
So does that assume that food in the U.S. is relatively cheap relative to the rest of the world?
It is incredibly cheap relative
Okay. So if we
to our income.
Relative to what you said about New England, you know, if we grew food here, you wouldn't know what it would cost. Okay. I mean, if let's say we're representative of the rest of the country and we're 7%, is it going to cost us 14%? You know, or is it going to be 21%? I mean, if you had a gun to your head, what would you guess?
It's hard to know you because, you know, like the price of food at the farm is only a small part of what we end up paying for the food. So it's a complicated, I mean, I don't want to just dodge the question. I want to be forthright in that it will cost more. I think it will still be a reasonable part of most people's incomes. And a lot of people could afford it if they chose to, if they want food that they consider better in some ways, that's healthier and all the rest of that. But I think the real question is, as we've been alluding to, there are all these externalized costs of producing the food, the cheap food that have to do with people's health and the health of the environment and the labor that produces the food between the farmers and the farm workers and the people all through the food system. So what we need to be talking about is how can we have a food system that compensates all of that well? And how do we pay for that?
I just had a question and observation here. I looked at the map and the density here of forests, and I saw the great second home, the great state of Maine, still maintaining its great forested areas. And I was interested to see that you only showed a really 2 million population growth within New England. I wonder, is that taking into account the coming great migration that's going to happen because of climate change? And when I look at the world back the way it was even 50 years ago here, and now look the way it is now, and see things like Arena Farm, which is now housing, how is that going to be really impacted if we see a 100% growth in population here? How are we going to be able to maintain the food supply for our own people, let alone for the world?
Well, we're not maintaining a food supply for our own people now. But the question I sort of started to address before, it could be that we'll get a much larger population growth here, and it'll be much more difficult to grow food and more expensive than it has been because of the kind of changes you're talking about. If that's the case, it might be that we decide to clear more forests and bear the environmental costs of doing that. I will say, in terms of the state of Maine, a lot of the acreage increase is in Maine, it's in southern Maine, of agriculture. A lot of northern Maine is not great agricultural land, setting aside Aroostook County. So we expect that most of that's going to stay pretty heavily forested. But I mean, huge changes could take place, external changes driving the system that would mean all kinds of things out there. But that's still a pretty enormous change in the landscape to go from, 5% cleared to 15. So maybe stuff will happen that makes us do more than that.
It also requires, to your question, that we also address the land use policy. Because you can't talk about ag policy without talking about land use policy. Does that land get turned into suburban development, or do we actually concentrate on density housing and zoning? So this is not going to work, never does. I mean, land is a finite commodity. The use of that land ends up being a really big battle, especially in greater Boston. Is it better off being 100 apartment units or 3 houses? And I think that's the great dilemma when we talk about former farmland.
We allowed developed land in New England to increase from about 10%, which it is today, to 12% in these 2 forest and farm visions. So there's some space for growth in terms of suburbanization, but it's really not chopping up a lot of the landscape in aggregate. What it is doing is changing some of the best farmland, some of the best local farmland near cities. It's parcelizing the landscape and knocking it into smaller pieces. We are now talking to people about doing the urban infrastructure side of the same vision that talks about what kind of growth do we want, how do we rebuild urban and rural economies within this same kind of framework.
Community gardens.
Community gardens would be an important part of this, but remember that's just addressing vegetables. It's not like we're going to grow wheat and throw in a few chickens. So I'm all for community gardens, and I've spent a good part of my life, doing local agricultural vegetable production with kids in the suburbs. It's kind of what I did through the first half of my life, and so it's great, but it's not like that's going to feed everybody. It's part of it, and it's important.
Let me ask Sarah a question around my mind. When we think about food and farm policy. Farm policy and food policy should never be assumed to be the same thing. Through your work, how does agricultural policy, it's called that, get affected by the momentary sort of public perception about farmers? That is the iconic image of farmers, especially in urban consumers' mind. How does that affect the way that this evolves over time?
It's a great question, and after the Depression, I'm not sure that there are moments when it really does. I think it's a very isolated policy process, which is one of the reasons why it has also endured with all the flaws. There are moments of rhetorical connection between the American public and farm policy. A good example is the 1960s. And for the 1960s, the fight over farm scale was not environmental sustainability the way it is now. It was about preserving an owner-operated farm in the context of the Cold War, right? The Russians, the Soviets, they collectivized their farms. We in America, we have a better rate of production with all of these individual units. They represent, they're the operating definition of economic freedom. Fast forward to the 1970s and 1980s, there were real reforms in the farm bills. Like 1985 is huge moment for conservation. And the rhetorical connections there was the environmental consumer movements. So there have been, and the farm scale debate is about how to produce the best landscape and food for urban consumers. So I think that there are moments of rhetorical connections, but it's a very isolated process, and farm policy is so hard that, you can spend a decade studying it as I have, and you're still going to get some question that you can't answer because it's just too hard. Like, if you ask me, what's the difference between the sugar and the milk program, I'll try, but it's very, very tricky to master, and without mastering that, you can't get into this markup section, those sessions. It's very isolated. I don't know if that helps.
Yes. In the last election, we had a ballot question on free range and extra cages, and all of that. And the opposition basically said that would raise the prices of eggs and a lot of things. substantially. And what do you see as the effect of that question? And as a farmer, how did you view it?
Oh boy. Yeah, I was actually interested that nationally the Farm Bureau and so forth didn't seem to throw a lot of effort into that. Do you want to? Oh, yeah. So locally, the Massachusetts Farm Bureau and so forth opposed that with the argument that you're putting forward, because the thing that passed affects everything we buy, no matter where it's produced in the country, right? I think so. But it was curious to me, and I have to confess, I didn't really put a lot of time and effort into thinking about it, partly because I have a suspicion that somehow it's going to be overridden at the national level, like Vermont's GMO bill, where Congress rushed in and passed its own GMO bill that says, oh yes, now you do have to label. We'll just put it in a language that you cannot read because it's just down in the barcode someplace. So my instinct was, if this was really going to drive industrial scale producers out, there would have been a lot more money poured in here to stop it. And so I sort of at that point sort of said, well, I don't care that much. I'm sort of for it in principle. I do think that some of these regulations are well-meaning. So I have beef cattle. We leave them out all winter, in the rain, in the snow. Devons, they love it. They can get under the barn and out of that if the weather is really, really, really bad. There are people who drive around and see those cows out in the rain, and they call the Humane Society. We even can get a visit. Say, they can get under the barn and so forth. So there's a part of this that's just about people who just don't understand livestock. But there's a part of it that I'm very sympathetic to, because the way we raise livestock in these huge confined operations really is atrocious and offends me. You know, I like to kill and eat livestock that I have known or that I have some confidence have had a reasonably pleasant life. So I do feel, I did actually vote for the thing, if you want to know. But I had this instinct that it wasn't going to make a hell of a lot of difference, because if it was, where was the big opposition to it? They would not have overlooked that. Sorry, I'm
No, in fact, I think to follow up on that, the Farm Bill's up for renewal next Congress, and you can bet Steve King in Iowa is going to insert an amendment somewhere that's going to overrule all the state ballot initiatives on animal welfare, because he tried the last Farm Bill.
Can they do that?
What's that?
Can they do that?
Sure they can do it. It's called federal preemption. Of course they can do it. They did it with the GMO labeling, effectively. That was the point that Brian was making. So yeah, this is why, if you care about these issues, pay attention to the Farm Bill, because this is going to be interesting to watch.
This is an administration that talks about states' authority and state supremacy.
They talk about that until it's...
Yeah. Remember, the Farm Bill is, I'll give you a quick point about this. The Farm Bill is driven primarily by Congress. Presidents don't drive the Farm Bill. They tell Congress what they don't want to see. But this is classic local politics. The Farm Bill, we'll talk more about the Farm Bill later on, but this is driven by local interest embedded in farm-producing states, food-producing states. Presidents, at a high level, they pay attention. They may state some general principles. For the most part, they stay away from it, because it's almost invariably ends in heartbreak for them.
So I just had a question. You showed Professor Donahue the USDA food recommendation plate. That's more driven politically than it is health-wise. So how does that impact all of this food production?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is true, but most of the recommendations in that are kind of middle of the road, a lot healthier for us than the way we're eating now. So we doubled our vegetable consumption as they recommend. We tripled our fruit consumption per capita as they recommend. And we kind of went down the line. On protein, they don't really say anything. They say, here's the amount of protein you want to have. They don't say, They don't take a stand on whether it should be animal or plant. So we were free to play around with that, and we shifted it much more plant-based. The big one where we deviated from them was on dairy. Because their recommendation is that we go from the 1.7 cups per capita of dairy that we consume today to like 3. And there are not a lot of nutritionists out there who are okay with that. So we shifted on dairy to our healthy plate instead, which kept it where it was. Because the political pressure on trying to get our dairy consumption up is very strong. Is that? So we cheated from USDA.
Yeah. Professor Donahue, I was intrigued by the notion that you think with some reasonable scenario and projections for growth, we could actually produce in New England 50% of our food needs. My question really is, who would produce it? Where would you get people on farms like that?
You want the flip answer? My students.
Good, I'm glad to hear it.
Because
your students from Brandeis.
From Brandeis. They're just like me. I dropped out of Brandeis to start producing food in 1975, and kind of stuck in my case. But it's not really a flip answer because we're not talking about a hell of a lot of people. We're talking today, there's 30,000 farms in New England. So if we tripled our production, some of that would happen on existing farms, we'd be talking about 50 or 100,000 farms. Out of 15 or 17 million people, it's a very, we go from, if our whole national food system shifted in other regions, changed in other kind of ways to similar sorts of visions, you might go from 2% of the population actually on farms to 4 or 5%. This is not about everyone going back to the farm. It is about engaging many more people in producing food part of the time, locally with more gardens. I mean, it's part of the vision is engaging more people in food production. But the problem is not going to be finding people who want to grow the food. People love growing food. It's great work.
People the loans.
The problem is getting them connected with the land, because land is expensive, getting them in some kind of economic situation where they can halfway make a living at it, especially on a small scale. Those are the big issues that the people working on this thing, the groups around New England like Land for Good and the Maine Farmland Trust and all these great people who are sort of part of this are trying to tackle that. How do we connect people to land? How do we give them the tools to succeed at it? Yeah, it's not finding the people to do it. Which may be what you were getting at as well. Yeah.
Jerry, do you want to answer that? I want to play second fiddle with Brian.
Okay, this is for Professor Phillips. We talked about the history of the Farm Bill for domestic production of crops, but we also talked about what we eat isn't exclusively from America. So how does the Farm Bill address food that's imported and the tariff on that food, and what's the history of that? That's an enormous question, but
the regulation of imports. I can't speak to that. Perhaps the instructor can. But embedded in the Farm Bill is all that sorts of trade legislation that does cover that. I'll let it be in.
Most of the Farm Bill doesn't. Most of the Farm Bill only deals with imports in ways that, for example, it only deals in some sense regulatory terms. That, for example, inspection of imported seafood. There really is very little in the Farm Bill per se that deals with imports and tariff issues. And all that stuff is really outside the Farm Bill. It's really in areas like, WTO, World Trade Organization rules. World Trade Organization rules dictate a lot of what you can do in agricultural policy.
The Farm Bill still gives the Secretary of Agriculture authority to engage in market stabilization programs, which often involves the relations between domestic and international producers.
And a lot of times it's when domestic producers complain that imports undercut them. And it's usually, they claim unfair market competition. There's always a bit of a grain of salt with some of that, but there's competition between U.S. growers and, say, Brazilians on cotton or on soybeans. Or there's competition. One of the best examples in the last Farm Bill was competition about imported Vietnamese or Southeast Asian catfish versus domestic catfish, and whether the domestic catfish is being undercut unfairly because the imported catfish was being raised in unsanitary conditions. So we're going to have a new USDA catfish inspection station that would replicate an FDA one that already existed, because the people in the ag industry thought the FDA one wasn't being tough enough on the imported catfish. That's the level of granularity you get in the Farm Bill. But so it's not an easy answer. Most of the Farm Bill, when it deals with export-import, deals mostly with export promotion. Shipping our stuff overseas, or as aid. That is, shipping U.S. food either as export to be purchased or as aid to be distributed in some way. We'll talk about in a couple of weeks. So yeah, in that respect.
Another kind of big picture question. What percentage of a dollar's worth of production today is covered by or is attributable to labor? And to what extent will the adoption of robotics and other forms of more efficient production in the industrial world become significant in the farming world as well?
I don't know the answer to that. I know, again, that it's going to vary a lot from one crop to another. So there's much more labor involved in the production of vegetables and fruits.
Yeah.
And there's almost no labor involved in the production of wheat.
Yeah,
One guy's got a couple thousand acres. So you have to look that way. And so, yeah, with the robotics, who knows?
Is anything happening today robotically?
Sure. Oh, yeah, you bet.
I don't know.
No, there's tractors. I mean, they're going down from one farmer producing a couple thousand acres of wheat to zero.
I mean, agriculture is so highly technologized today that they're the leading edge in using drones. They're the leading edge in using GIS technology. I mean, the fruit and vegetable growers are trying to figure out how can you pick strawberries with less labor. How do you mechanize strawberry production? You can imagine strawberries, that's hard. But they're trying because of that labor issue. It's not just, and so then, yeah, fruits and vegetables are the toughest area because they're labor intensive compared to row crops or even animals increasingly.
There's much more robotic milking of cows coming along. Yeah, there's a lot of that out there, and a lot of this is a debate between that model that continues to produce food cheaper and cheaper, and those of us who are basically agrarian in our point of view and are saying there are a lot of other values involved in the production and consumption of food that it would be worthwhile getting back in there. But we are fighting an enormous economic and political tide to try to make any progress in that direction.
This is a question for Professor Donahue. I'm wondering about the potential of urban farming and vertical farming to alleviate the conflict between forest services and agricultural services.
It has virtually no possibility of doing the last part of what you said. And I want to differentiate between urban and vertical farming. Again, if we look at the production of vegetables, a lot of the land that we need to do that can be squeezed out of urban and suburban areas. That couple 100,000 acres, you can find that in Boston and the suburbs around here. You can find a good bit of it. And so growing that stuff in urban areas is enormously valuable. Not just, you can do it at a reasonable price, but you can involve so many people in it and empower them and all those great social benefits, and it's fresh and it's local, so it's great. So I'm all for it. And maybe vertical farming and hydroponics and so forth can be part of that. But then, that doesn't take many acres. So it has no impact on the forest one way or another. The stuff that has an impact on, the rest of the environment out there, the grasslands, the wetlands, the forest, is the meat, the wheat, the grain, the oils, that stuff. You're not going to grow on that stuff, I don't think, in vertical farms. I mean, the value just isn't there. Does that sort of get at it? So you got to differentiate between different parts of the food system and different kinds of foods.
I would actually adding a plug here. She's been doing research on urban agriculture in China. And she's going to be going back to China pretty soon on a fellowship study in China. And so we're very pleased with that. So I thought I'd do a shout out.
Hello there. This is a question, I think, for all three panelists. And I'm trying to frame this in such a way that it's coherent. But from a policy perspective, a historical perspective, a regional farmer's perspective, can you comment on how food is marketed? So for example, I recently learned that there's no such thing as organic seafood in the United States, whereas there is such a thing as organic seafood in Europe. And the leading argument for bringing organic certification standards to the US, which is currently being drafted by the USDA, is to bring seafood farmers, those that fish wild fish, into a greater state of equal competition with the worldwide markets. So I'm just curious to know a little bit more about how you think how food is marketed, how policy is even marketed, and how it's been marketed differently over time can contribute to a more sustainable food policy.
The historical perspective, unfortunately, isn't going to give you this kind of policy prescriptions you might want, except when I think about my role as a historian of the post-war period, it really is to try to convince other historians that the problem of surplus of plenty has moved politics in lots of ways. When we think about marketing, one of the major reasons the USDA engages in aggressive overseas marketing and surplus disposal is because they need to find new markets for all this stuff. And so that the growth of the agricultural state, the agricultural policy apparatus, the bureaucracy, is finding markets, finding markets, finding markets. And it's a part of the distributive vision that markets can always be found. Whereas producerists would say markets should be retained for indigenous producers. Like surplus disposal isn't helping other countries gain food security as much. So the historical isn't what you were looking for, but thank you for asking, letting me participate. I'm going to hand it over to our expert.
Oh man, I'm no expert on that at all. I think there's a lot we can do with policy in terms of shifting what is supported by the Farm Bill and, better standards of production and standards for protect workers and the health and all these kinds of things, for sure. But I also know that it's going to be an enormous struggle because the vested interests in protecting the way the thing runs now are so very powerful, and the nuts and bolts of it are so complex to deal with. So it's, I look at, I'm maybe answering your question as obliquely as you were trying to pull it together, and maybe it's not speaking to it directly, but the way I think about this is that the policy changes cannot drive this transformation. Because there's no magic wand to wave to make those kinds of political changes and then get these other things to happen. And I look at it as a kind of a process whereby if we get more people who are interested in producing food in these kinds of ways that are sustainable and healthier and all the rest of that, and some more of them go to live in rural areas, and there's a gradual political change, then you can get yourself in the position where you can make policy changes that really help reinforce that. That's sort of the way I think about this vision in the next 50 or 100 years, how some of this transformation might take place, how the policy part of it might gradually evolve to make the kinds of positive changes that I would consider positive. Is that at all?
I mean, let me just add that. The fact is there's going to be a fight over these definitions because there's money involved. I mean, the fact is the entire battle over what is organic, it's about who is going to benefit in terms of, it's always follow the money is always the rule. And if there's a fight about some notion of labeling seafood as organic, because people identify an opportunity to make money off of desires by consumers for organic foods that they perceive, for whatever reason, that they perceive that organic will be better in whatever way they mean that. That's a battle. I mean, the whole debate about what organic really means. To some people it means small farms, local, that's their image in their head about organic, but that's not necessarily the case. These are You know, and so I think it's really about what people's imaginings are about what these things mean, versus also real sectors of the economy identifying an opportunity to take advantage and make money. So that's sort of what this is really about. Sophie, you get the last chance.
Hi, thank you Professor Bosso for setting this up, and thank you so much Professor Phillips and Professor Donahue for coming to speak. I really appreciate it, and I think everyone else does as well. So my question, I think, would probably be for Professor Donahue, just with the New England Food Vision for 2060, where do you see the like having these farms that would allow for New England to produce more of their food, and how right now the big ag and how there's only a few companies that produce most of our seeds, or how Bayer and Monsanto have combined, where you see, like, we're going to have more smaller farms, like what Professor Bosso was just saying, or is it going to be these huge farms controlled by these huge companies again? If that makes sense.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay. It's hard to see scope within New England for a lot of this sort of large-scale agriculture, although it's not inconceivable. So the kinds of things that we were talking about, on dairy production. Well, let's take dairy production for an example. What we were talking about that's grass-based, it's a little hard to have a really large grass-based dairy operation. I suppose it could be done, but the problem, to have gazillions of cows. Like the average dairy herd now, the ones that are commercially out there, is many hundreds of cows and getting up into the thousands in places. If you do it grass-based, the cows have got to walk to the grass and back every day, and you're kind of limited to 100 cows or so. So this vision is based around smaller and medium-sized farms. In the real world of how things develop, who knows? Again, it's going to be a long, complex struggle with the economics of it, with the availability of land, with the political process of defining who gets subsidies and what kind of environmental regulations. That's a lot of stuff. I wasn't much of an answer. Sorry.
That's okay.
It's
complicated.
It's complicated, and I would not look for solutions overnight. It's something to keep plugging away at.
I just want to say, I was once at a conference and I heard a biologist say a phrase I've repeated for 5 years, which is that in any ecosystem you have to preserve a diversity of scales. There's no ones. And so to think of farms as either being ideally small or huge is not helpful as preserving a diversity of scales in agriculture. And even though I'm no expert, I loved the phrase. And I think it's useful for thinking about different scales as addressing different kinds of problems.
First, I'd like to thank our guests for the wonderful job they're doing.